Russia still has the thing Ukraine cannot easily match: mass. A broader manpower pool, a larger industrial base, greater territorial depth, and a military system capable of feeding a war that has now lasted for years. And yet, mass is not the same thing as momentum. Russia is still attacking. It is still taking ground in some sectors. But across 2026, its overall rate of advance has slowed even as Moscow continues to pour men, ammunition, drones, and equipment into the fight. That creates a puzzle. If Russia can still generate more raw military resources than Ukraine, why is that advantage producing such limited movement on the map? The answer begins with a system most people never see. A soldier cannot fight simply because he exists. A shell cannot matter because it left a factory. A vehicle has no battlefield value sitting hundreds of kilometers from the front. All of it has to be recruited, organized, moved, supplied, concentrated, commanded, reinforced, and sustained. That conversion process is where military mass becomes combat power. And Ukraine is increasingly trying to attack that process itself. Not by matching Russia soldier for soldier, but by making the system behind those soldiers slower, more exposed, and more expensive to operate. To understand what that means, we first have to look at the machine behind an offensive. Military power is often measured in things that are easy to count: soldiers, tanks, artillery pieces, missiles, factories, and ammunition. But those numbers describe potential power, not necessarily usable power. For an army to turn resources into battlefield pressure, a long chain has to work. First, people have to be recruited. Then they have to be trained, equipped, organized into units, and moved toward the sector where commanders actually need them. Once there, they need ammunition, fuel, food, communications, medical support, engineering equipment, drone teams, and replacements. Artillery has to receive shells. Vehicles need maintenance. Command posts need reliable links to subordinate units. Damaged equipment has to be recovered or replaced. And all of this has to happen repeatedly. An offensive is not sustained by a single delivery. It is sustained by throughput. How much combat power a military system can keep pushing forward over time. That distinction matters because Russia's advantage is not simply that it possesses more resources. Its real advantage comes from its ability to convert those resources into forces that can keep attacking. A recruit in central Russia does not matter to a battalion near the front until a chain of decisions and logistics moves him there. A stockpile of artillery ammunition has no operational effect until it reaches the right gun units in useful quantities. A replacement vehicle sitting far behind the front does not help a formation that needs it today. Every step creates dependencies, and every dependency creates a possible point of friction. That does not mean Ukraine has to destroy the entire chain. Military logistics rarely works like a light switch that is either on or off. Large armies build redundancy precisely because roads are blocked, bridges are damaged, vehicles break down, and supply plans fail. The more important question is efficiency. If a convoy has to take a longer route, it still may arrive, but later. If supplies have to be divided among smaller vehicles, they may still reach the front, but with more trips. If command posts have to disperse, they may survive longer, but coordination becomes more complicated. If troops must move in smaller groups to avoid detection, they may still reach the battlefield, but concentration takes more time. None of these effects alone means collapse. Together, however, they can create what might be called a logistics tax. Extra time, vehicles, protection, planning, fuel, and organizational effort required to produce the same amount of usable combat power at the front. And that tax becomes more important the more an army wants to attack. Offensive warfare is demanding. Troops move forward. Ammunition consumption rises. Vehicles shuttle between rear areas and fighting positions. Engineering units open routes. Reinforcements replace casualties. Drone and artillery teams need continuous resupply. The larger the offensive effort, the more movement the system generates. And in this war, movement has become increasingly difficult to hide. The problem becomes clearer once we stop thinking of logistics as something happening behind the war and start treating it as part of the war itself. Every offensive creates movement. Infantry replacements have to reach forward positions. Ammunition has to move from larger depots to smaller distribution points and then closer to the units consuming it. Fuel has to reach vehicles, generators, and support equipment. Drone teams need batteries, airframes, antennas, explosives, and replacement electronics. Engineers need mines, construction material, specialized equipment, and vehicles. Damaged systems have to be recovered, repaired, or replaced. None of this is optional. A unit can conserve ammunition for a time. can postpone maintenance, can operate with fewer vehicles. But every shortfall eventually reduces what that unit can do. This is why supply is not simply about whether something arrives. Timing matters. Imagine two identical formations with the same number of troops and the same amount of ammunition available somewhere in the rear. The first can receive replacements, shells, and vehicles quickly enough to maintain pressure after an assault. The second receives exactly the same resources, but only after routes are changed. Loads are divided into smaller movements, vehicles wait for safer conditions, and forward distribution points are repeatedly relocated. On paper, both formations were supplied. Operationally, they are not in the same position. The first can keep attacking while the enemy is still recovering. The second may give that enemy time to reinforce, lay mines, rotate troops, reposition drones, and rebuild defensive positions. That difference is tempo, and tempo is one of the ways logistics turns into battlefield advantage. The same principle applies to concentration. An offensive force usually becomes more powerful when commanders can bring multiple capabilities together at the right moment. Infantry, artillery, drones, engineering units, electronic warfare, armored vehicles, reconnaissance, and reserves. But concentration creates signatures. More vehicles appear on roads. More radio traffic is generated. More supplies move toward a particular sector. Temporary staging areas become busier. Ammunition consumption rises. The act of preparing to generate more combat power can therefore make the system more visible. This creates a fundamental problem on a drone-saturated battlefield. The larger the force commanders want to assemble, the more activity they must hide. And if hiding that activity becomes too difficult, they have to adapt. They can move at different times, use alternative roads, break convoys into smaller elements, push supplies through more distribution points, keep command posts farther apart, send troops forward in smaller groups, store less ammunition in any single location. All of those adaptations can work, but they also change the mathematics of the system. A truck forced onto a longer route consumes more fuel and more driver time. 10 small deliveries require more coordination than one large delivery. A depot split across several locations is harder to destroy in one strike, but harder to manage. A unit arriving in several small groups is less visible than a large column, but it takes longer to assemble into something capable of coordinated action. This is the logistics tax. It does not require empty fuel tanks or ammunition shortages to matter. The tax exists whenever the same battlefield effect requires more time, more movement, more vehicles, more protection, or more organizational effort than it did before. And an army with greater resources can often pay that tax. Russia has enormous advantages in depth and redundancy compared with a smaller military system. Roads can be changed. Loads can be redistributed. Damaged vehicles can be replaced. New depots can be established. The question is not whether Russia can adapt. It can. The question is how expensive that adaptation becomes, and whether those costs accumulate quickly enough to reduce the speed at which Russia can turn its larger resource base into pressure at the front. For Ukraine, this changes the objective. It does not need to intercept every shipment. It does not need to destroy every truck. And it certainly does not need to create a complete logistical blockade across an enormous front. It needs to make enough movement dangerous enough, often enough, that Russian commanders are forced to spend increasing amounts of effort simply keeping the conversion machine functioning. For much of modern warfare, armies could assume that once equipment and supplies were moved far enough behind the front, they entered a relatively safer zone. That assumption is becoming much harder to maintain, because the drones that first transformed the front line are now pushing the battlefield deeper into the rear. Before Ukraine could threaten Russia's logistics deep behind the fighting, drones had already transformed the space immediately around the front. The change was gradual, but its consequences were enormous. Early in the war, reconnaissance drones gave both sides a much clearer picture of enemy positions. Artillery units could receive coordinates faster. Commanders could watch roads, trenches, and staging areas without relying entirely on ground observers or expensive aircraft. Then first-person view attack drones spread across the battlefield. A relatively inexpensive drone could now hunt individual vehicles, firing positions, antennas, small groups of infantry, or troops moving between cover. That changed the relationship between visibility and survival. A target no longer had to remain exposed long enough for an artillery battery to identify it, calculate a firing solution, and bring shells onto the position. In many cases, the sensor and the weapon could now be part of the same tactical network. This created what soldiers increasingly describe as a kill zone around the front. an area in which movement can be detected, tracked, and attacked with very little warning. The depth of that zone is not identical everywhere.
Terrain matters.
Electronic warfare matters. Weather matters. The availability of relay drones and repeaters matters. So does the density of trained operators on each sector. But in some areas, Ukrainian units have reported the effective drone danger zone expanding well beyond the immediate trench line. In the Kupiansk area, for example, one Ukrainian unit reported in August that its drone kill zone had expanded from roughly 15 kilometers to around 25. That should not be treated as a universal measurement for the entire front, but it illustrates the direction of travel. The battlefield is becoming deeper, and the deeper that zone becomes, the harder it is to operate the kinds of formations that traditionally generate offensive power. Consider what a large assault group requires. Vehicles must approach. Infantry must assemble. Engineers may need to clear obstacles. Artillery and drone teams must prepare supporting fires. Commanders need communications. Reserves have to remain close enough to exploit success. Every one of those activities produces a signature. A reconnaissance drone may see vehicles entering a tree lane. Another drone may identify a new antenna. Radio frequency detection may reveal an active position. A road that was quiet for hours may suddenly show repeated traffic. One observation means little. Several observations connected together can reveal a pattern. And patterns are dangerous. This is why both Russian and Ukrainian forces have increasingly avoided the kind of obvious mass formations that would once have been associated with a major assault. Russian forces in particular have made extensive use of small infantry groups, infiltration tactics, motorcycles, all-terrain vehicles, and dispersed movement in sectors where large concentrations would be vulnerable. That adaptation is sometimes misunderstood. Sending small groups forward is not necessarily evidence that Russian commanders have forgotten how to conduct combined arms warfare. It is, in part, a rational response to a battlefield where concentration can attract rapid detection and destruction. A smaller group is harder to see. A motorcycle crosses exposed ground faster than a truck. Infantry filtering through tree lines or damaged settlements may get closer to Ukrainian positions without creating the signature of a conventional assault column. And sometimes these tactics work. Small groups can infiltrate weak points, establish temporary positions, and create uncertainty about where the actual line of control lies. But they create another problem. Infiltration is not the same thing as consolidation. A handful of soldiers reaching a village does not automatically mean the village has become a functioning Russian position. To hold ground, the force usually needs more people. It needs ammunition. It needs communications. It may need heavier weapons, drone teams, engineers, medical evacuation, and a reliable route for reinforcement. In other words, the system eventually has to catch up with the infiltration. That is where battlefield transparency begins to affect more than tactics. If large groups are dangerous near the front, commanders can disperse them farther back and move them forward gradually. But that solution depends on having rear areas where troops and supplies can still be staged with relative safety. For a time, that was the natural answer. Keep the vulnerable concentration farther from the trenches. Break movement into smaller pieces. Then push those pieces forward as needed. But the logic only works as long as the deeper rear remains meaningfully safer. Ukraine's next adaptation has been to challenge that assumption. The deeper rear was supposed to solve the problem. If Russian troops could not safely concentrate close to the front, they could stage farther back, move in smaller packets, and feed men and supplies forward as needed. But that only works if distance still creates safety. By the summer of 2026, Ukraine was increasingly testing that assumption. The most important change was not a single drone model. It was the growing ability to detect and strike targets tens of kilometers behind the front, sometimes much farther across the roads, depots, fuel sites, and drone infrastructure that connect Russian rear areas to active sectors. One of the clearest examples is the M14 corridor in southern occupied Ukraine. This road is not Russia's only supply line. Moscow can use other roads, rail links, local stockpiles, and alternative routes. But the M14 is strategically useful because it connects major occupied areas along the Azov coast and supports movement across the southern theater. In early August, geolocated footage showed Ukrainian drones striking Russian cargo trucks on the M14 southwest of Melitopol. A Ukrainian commander in the Huliapol sector claimed that strikes on Russian transport routes had reduced movement in rear areas roughly 60 to 100 kilometers from the front. That claim comes from the Ukrainian side and should be treated accordingly. But it was not the only signal. A Russian military blogger also disputed official claims that normal traffic had been restored on the highway, saying Ukrainian drones were still striking trucks there and arguing that Russia needed more mobile fire groups to protect the road. That combination matters. A Ukrainian commander describes a constraint. Geolocated footage confirms vehicles are being hit on the route, and a Russian source acknowledges that the threat remains serious enough to require additional defenses. None of that proves the road has been cut. It shows something more subtle. The route is being contested, and Ukraine's campaign is not confined to one highway. By mid-August, Ukrainian forces were reporting strikes against ammunition storage, logistics sites, drone infrastructure, and transport vehicles at depths ranging from a few dozen kilometers to much farther behind the front. Some of those reports came directly from Ukrainian military authorities and cannot all be independently confirmed. Others were supported by geolocated imagery showing Russian vehicles being struck on roads well behind the immediate fighting. The individual targets are less important than the pattern. The rear is becoming a gradient of risk. Closest to the front, FPV drones can make individual movement extremely dangerous. Farther back, intermediate-range systems threaten roads, warehouses, command nodes, fuel infrastructure, and drone facilities. And beyond that, longer-range weapons can reach industrial and strategic targets hundreds of kilometers away. There is no single line where the battlefield ends and safety begins. That changes the logic of logistics. A road does not have to be physically destroyed to become less useful. If drones can repeatedly appear over a predictable route, commanders may change when vehicles move. They may split cargo into smaller loads. They may use different roads, add electronic warfare, deploy mobile air defense or fire teams, conceal vehicles, or stage supplies farther from known danger areas. All of those measures can preserve the flow. But preserving the flow is not free. Every detour adds distance. Every additional protection unit is a resource that could be used somewhere else. Every smaller load requires more movements to transport the same quantity. Every depot pushed deeper into the rear lengthens the final journey toward the front. And every extra layer of concealment, coordination, and timing creates another task for the organization to manage. This is why interdiction in a drone war does not need to resemble the great air campaigns of the 20th century. Ukraine does not need to crater every road or destroy every bridge. The objective can be behavioral. Make predictable movement dangerous enough that the opponent has to reorganize how the entire flow works. That is a much harder effect to measure than counting destroyed trucks. A destroyed vehicle is visible. A convoy delayed for 6 hours is not. A route quietly abandoned is difficult to quantify. A depot moved 30 kilometers farther away does not appear as a dramatic change on a battlefield map. But these are exactly the kinds of adaptations that can accumulate into operational friction. The critical question is whether that friction remains local and manageable, or becomes persistent enough to affect the tempo of Russian operations. Because Russia is not simply absorbing the strikes, it is adapting to them. Ukraine's deeper strikes create a problem for Russia. They do not create a helpless opponent. Russian forces are adapting, because any military system that survives long enough under persistent attack eventually has to change how it operates. The first response is dispersion. A large concentration of vehicles, ammunition, or troops creates an attractive target. Splitting that concentration across several smaller locations makes a single strike less damaging. The same logic applies to movement. A large convoy can move supplies efficiently, but it is also easier to detect and more rewarding to attack. Smaller loads reduce the value of each individual strike. Vehicles can use different roads, travel at different times, or wait for periods when Ukrainian surveillance is weaker. These are not signs that logistics have stopped working. They are attempts to keep logistics working under new conditions. Electronic warfare is another part of that adaptation. Drones depend on communications, navigation, and control links. Russian forces can use jamming and other electronic countermeasures to disrupt some of those systems, force operators to change frequencies, reduce effective range, or complicate navigation. That creates another cycle of adaptation. Ukraine develops longer-range drones and more resilient communications. Russia improves electronic warfare and protection. Ukraine changes frequencies, guidance methods, relay networks, or flight profiles. Russia adjusts again. The contest does not end when one side introduces a new technology. It moves. Physical protection matters too. If a particular road becomes dangerous, mobile fire groups or air defense assets can be assigned to protect it. Vehicles can be concealed near buildings or tree lines. Supplies can be staged in smaller depots. Command posts can move more frequently. Drone operators can relocate their antennas and control stations. Russia can also push vulnerable infrastructure farther back. In August, evidence emerged that Russia was expanding and relocating elements of its long-range drone launch network deeper inside Russian territory. One likely purpose was to increase survivability after Ukrainian forces demonstrated that launch infrastructure in occupied territory could itself be targeted. Moving a site farther away may protect it, but that illustrates the central trade-off. Protection usually changes something else. A depot farther from the front means a longer final delivery route. A command post that disperses more widely may be harder to destroy, but coordination can become more complicated. A convoy divided into several movements presents fewer targets at once, but requires more trips. A force broken into small assault groups may cross exposed ground with less visibility, but it cannot instantly generate the same concentrated combat power as a larger formation. None of those trade-offs automatically favors Ukraine. Russia may decide that the additional complexity is entirely acceptable. A large military system can absorb inefficiency if it has enough vehicles, fuel, personnel, repair capacity, and infrastructure. That is why counting destroyed trucks is not enough. The real question is whether Russia can adapt faster than Ukraine can impose new costs. And Russia is not merely defending its own system. It is attacking Ukraine's conversion machine as well. Russian forces have expanded their own battlefield interdiction campaign, using drones, missiles, glide bombs, and other systems against Ukrainian roads, logistics nodes, drone infrastructure, and positions in the rear. The strategic logic is almost identical. Ukraine also has to move ammunition. Ukraine also has to rotate infantry. Its drone units need airframes, batteries, antennas, explosives, and communications equipment. Its brigades depend on roads and distribution points. And because Ukraine operates with a smaller resource base, disruption to its own system can be extremely costly. This is therefore not a story in which Ukraine discovered drones while Russia remained trapped in an older form of warfare. Both sides understand the problem. Both sides are trying to extend the distance at which they can detect and attack the other supporting system. Both sides are trying to protect their own rear while making the opponent's rear less usable. That turns the battlefield into an adaptation race. A successful Ukrainian strike produces a Russian response. That response creates a new Ukrainian targeting problem. A Russian technological improvement creates a Ukrainian countermeasure. And each cycle changes where forces can safely move, where they can concentrate, and how much effort is required to support them. This is where Russia's numerical advantage begins to look different. Russia may still possess more soldiers, more equipment, and greater depth. But if those resources increasingly have to be dispersed, concealed, rerouted, protected, and moved forward in smaller increments, then mass does not disappear. It simply becomes harder to use as mass. This is where Russia's manpower advantage becomes more complicated than the headline number suggests. A country can have a larger population. Its military can recruit more soldiers. It can even place more personnel somewhere inside the theater. But none of that guarantees that enough combat power will appear at the right point, at the right time, in the right condition to exploit an opportunity. Manpower has to pass through the same conversion system as everything else. A civilian becomes a recruit. A recruit becomes a trained soldier. That soldier becomes part of a unit. The unit has to reach the correct sector, integrate with command structures, receive equipment and supplies, and remain connected to the support system behind it. Only then does manpower become useful battlefield strength. This distinction matters because Russia's recruitment system is showing signs of increasing pressure. Independent reporting based partly on Russian federal expenditure data suggests that the rate of new contract recruitment declined in late 2025 and into 2026. One estimate placed Russian contract recruitment during the first quarter of 2026 at roughly 800 to 1,000 people per day, around 20% below the same period a year earlier. That does not mean Russia is running out of soldiers. It does not tell us the exact size of the force available at the front. And it certainly does not mean Moscow can no longer replace losses. But it shows why manpower cannot be treated as an infinite pool that automatically converts into combat formations at a constant rate. There is also an important historical point. Russia's major partial mobilization began in September 2022, when Moscow called up roughly 300,000 reservists. Since then, Russia has relied heavily on contract recruitment, financial incentives, and other manpower channels rather than repeating a mobilization of the same public scale. That makes replacement flow important. But even if Russia continues recruiting enough people, those soldiers still have to reach the battlefield. And in some sectors, that journey itself has become part of the fight. On August 19th, the commander of a Ukrainian brigade operating in the Pokrovsk direction reported that Russian forces were again accumulating infantry for future offensive operations. That matters because it shows Russia is still trying to generate mass. But the same commander also claimed that some Russian troops were taking 3 to 4 days to move roughly 10 to 15 kilometers toward the front line. This is one Ukrainian commander describing one sector. It should not be treated as a measurement of conditions across the entire Russian army. But if the report is broadly representative of heavily contested sectors, it illustrates the conversion problem almost perfectly. 10 kilometers is not a great distance on a conventional military map. On a battlefield saturated with drones, it can become a multi-day exposure problem. Troops may have to move in small groups. They may wait for darkness, poor weather, gaps in surveillance, or a safer route. Vehicles may only be able to carry them part of the way. The final approach may have to be made on foot. That protects the force from presenting one large, obvious target. But it also changes how quickly commanders can accumulate combat power. And accumulation matters because attacking is not the same thing as breaking through. A small infiltration group can cross a gap in the defenses, can occupy a building, can hide in a tree line. It may even move several kilometers into territory that looks impressive on a map. But exploiting that penetration requires something more. More infantry has to arrive. Ammunition has to follow. Drone teams need positions. Communications have to be established. Supporting fires have to be coordinated. Reserves need to be close enough to exploit success before Ukraine can react. This is the paradox created by battlefield transparency. Dispersion makes forces harder to kill, but dispersion can also make them harder to combine quickly. The better an army becomes at hiding its mass, the more difficult it may become to use that mass all at once. That does not eliminate Russia's advantage. It changes the way the advantage can be expressed. Instead of a large formation rapidly concentrating and forcing a deep breakthrough, the result may be repeated small attacks, infiltrations, localized gains, and a slow accumulation of pressure. Russia can still advance this way. In fact, Russian forces continue to conduct offensive operations and have continued making gains in parts of the front during 2026. But those gains have generally come at a slower overall rate than earlier phases of the offensive cycle. The important question is why? Drone interdiction is almost certainly not the only answer. Ukrainian fortifications matter.
Terrain metteurs.
Russian casualties and force quality matter. Command decisions matter. Minefields, ammunition availability, weather, force density, and Ukrainian counterattacks all matter. So the argument cannot be that Ukrainian drones alone have slowed Russia. The stronger argument is that drones are increasingly attacking one of the mechanisms Russia needs in order to overcome those other constraints. The ability to move, assemble, reinforce, and sustain forces faster than Ukraine can respond. That is the real significance of the logistics campaign. Ukraine does not have to make Russian manpower disappear. It has to make each additional soldier more difficult to turn into timely, coordinated battlefield pressure. If that friction becomes persistent enough, Russia can still possess mass while finding it progressively harder to make that mass behave like mass. But if Russian logistics were truly being broken, why is Russia still attacking at all? If Ukrainian drones can now threaten Russian vehicles dozens of kilometers behind the front, fuel infrastructure much farther away, and some of the roads that sustain the southern theater, it is tempting to describe the result as a logistics collapse. That would go beyond the evidence. Russia still has one of the deepest military support systems in this war. Its forces do not depend on a single highway, warehouse, or fuel depot. They can use alternative roads, rail transport, dispersed storage sites, local stockpiles, repair facilities, and multiple layers of distribution between Russia and the front. When one route becomes dangerous, traffic can move elsewhere. When a depot is destroyed, supplies can be redistributed. When a vehicle is lost, another can replace it. That redundancy is exactly what makes a large logistics system difficult to break. And the battlefield provides the most obvious counter-evidence to any claim of collapse. Russian forces are still attacking. They continue to generate assault groups, move reserves, launch large numbers of drones and missiles, and make localized territorial gains. In August, Russia claimed that its summer campaign had captured 19 settlements across parts of southeastern Ukraine. Those specific claims were not independently verified by Reuters, and Russia's overall rate of advance in 2026 has slowed. But the larger point remains. An army whose logistics had truly collapsed would not still be capable of sustaining offensive operations across multiple sectors. So what Ukraine has created is better understood as friction. And friction can matter long before collapse. There is another reason for caution. Ukraine is exposed to the same logic. Russian forces are also trying to reach beyond Ukrainian frontline positions and attack the system behind them. Russia's defense ministry has repeatedly claimed strikes against facilities connected with Ukrainian drone production, military storage, logistics hubs, and other supporting infrastructure. Those target descriptions originate with Moscow and cannot simply be accepted as independent confirmation. But the targeting logic is clear. Russia understands that Ukrainian combat power also depends on factories, warehouses, roads, communications, drone infrastructure, and distribution networks. This is mutual systems warfare. And because Ukraine has the smaller resource base, the question of resilience matters just as much for Kiev as it does for Moscow. Even Russia's growing fuel problems have to be interpreted carefully. Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries have produced effects that are increasingly difficult to dismiss. By August, fuel shortages had returned across multiple Russian regions. Authorities and fuel companies introduced restrictions in some areas, while the government took measures including export controls and imports to stabilize supply. The effects were also reaching the civilian transport economy. Higher fuel costs were putting additional pressure on trucking and freight. That is real disruption. It shows that Ukraine can impose costs far beyond the individual facility it strikes. But there is still a missing causal step. A civilian trucker paying more for fuel inside Russia is not evidence that a Russian assault formation at the front has run out of diesel. Russia can prioritize military requirements, can draw from stocks, can redistribute supply. It can accept economic pain in one part of the system to preserve military throughput somewhere else. That is why economic disruption, logistics friction, and battlefield supply failure have to remain separate categories. The strongest argument does not require us to collapse them into one. Ukraine has demonstrated an increasing ability to force Russia to spend resources protecting, rerouting, replacing, and reorganizing parts of the system that sustain the war. Russia has demonstrated that it can absorb many of those costs and keep fighting. Both statements can be true at the same time, and that changes how we should measure success. The important metric is not simply how many trucks burn. It is whether Russia can continue delivering the same amount of useful combat power at the same speed and cost. If additional routes, vehicles, defenses, fuel, time, and coordination are required to maintain the same battlefield pressure, then the system has become less efficient even if it remains functional. If Russia can absorb those costs without significantly reducing its operational tempo, then Ukrainian interdiction remains a manageable burden. If it cannot, then tactical drone strikes begin producing operational consequences. That threshold has not yet been conclusively crossed across the entire front. But the contest is moving toward it, which means the central question is no longer whether Ukraine can hit Russia's logistics. Clearly can. The harder question is whether those hits can change the rate at which Russia turns resources into battlefield power. This is the point where the separate pieces of the war begin to fit together. Russia's advantage is not simply the number of soldiers it can recruit, the shells its factories can produce, or the vehicles available somewhere in its military system. Those resources matter only when they can be converted into pressure at the front. Russia has to move them. It has to concentrate them. It has to connect troops to ammunition, drones, communications, engineering support, command networks, and replacements. And then it has to keep that system functioning long enough to exploit whatever success its assault forces create. Ukraine is trying to interfere with that conversion. Near the front, dense drone coverage makes concentration dangerous. Farther back, intermediate-range strikes threaten vehicles, roads, depots, command infrastructure, and support sites that once operated with greater freedom. Deeper still, long-range strikes reach fuel and industrial infrastructure inside Russia itself. These layers are not interchangeable. A refinery strike hundreds of kilometers away does not produce the same battlefield effect as destroying a truck carrying ammunition toward an active sector. But they are connected by the same strategic logic. They increase the cost of delivering usable military power. Russia responds by dispersing. It reroutes. It expands electronic warfare, protects roads. It moves infrastructure deeper. It sends troops forward in smaller groups and reduces the signatures created by obvious concentrations. Those adaptations help keep the system alive. But adaptation itself consumes resources. This is the real contest behind the front. Ukraine is attempting to turn its strengths in drones, surveillance, communications, and targeting into friction. Russia is attempting to use depth, redundancy, industrial capacity, manpower, and adaptation to absorb that friction. And Russia is imposing the same problem in reverse. Its own drones and long-range weapons attack Ukrainian logistics, infrastructure, and production in an effort to make Ukraine's smaller resource base even harder to convert into combat power. So the decisive variable is not simply mass. It is conversion capacity. Imagine Russia possesses 100 units of potential military power. In a relatively permissive environment, perhaps a large share can be moved, concentrated, supplied, and employed quickly. But if roads become dangerous, depots disperse, movements become smaller, electronic protection becomes necessary, and troops require days rather than hours to cross contested rear areas, the same 100 units still exist. The exchange rate has changed. More effort is required to produce the same pressure at the front. That is the system Ukraine is attacking. Not Russia's population, not every factory, not every soldier, the connections between them. And this explains why the effects can be strategically important without looking dramatic on a map. A destroyed convoy produces obvious footage. A Russian commander deciding not to use that road tomorrow does not. A depot burning is visible. A depot quietly moved farther from the front is not. A vehicle loss can be counted. The additional hours required to assemble an assault force usually cannot. Yet those invisible costs may determine how quickly tactical success becomes operational momentum. This is also why the phrase "Russia still has more" does not settle the argument. Russia does still have more in many critical categories. But military power is never only what a state possesses. It is what the system can deliver, coordinate, concentrate, and sustain under enemy attack. Ukraine has not removed Russia's mass. It is trying to change the rate at which that mass becomes battlefield power. Whether it can push that process far enough to alter the strategic balance is the question that remains. So what exactly has Ukraine achieved? Not a collapse of Russian logistics, not the disappearance of Russia's manpower advantage, and not a permanent answer to Russia's ability to keep attacking. What Ukraine has done is make the conversion process more difficult. By extending surveillance and strike capability deeper behind the front, Ukrainian forces are increasingly threatening the roads, vehicles, depots, command infrastructure, and support systems. Russia needs to turn resources into sustained battlefield pressure. That matters because military power is not simply a stockpile. It is a flow. Men have to arrive. Ammunition has to arrive. Vehicles have to arrive. Commands have to move. Replacements have to move. And enough of those pieces have to come together at the right moment for an offensive to generate more than a temporary tactical gain. Ukraine is trying to interfere with that flow. The evidence so far suggests it is creating real friction in some sectors. Russian movement has been reported as more restricted across parts of the rear. Important routes have come under repeated drone attack. Logistic sites and support infrastructure are increasingly vulnerable at greater depth. Russian forces are responding with dispersion, rerouting, electronic warfare, deeper basing, and changes in how troops move toward the front. Those reactions are themselves evidence that the threat is being taken seriously. But they are not evidence that the system is failing. The next phase of this contest will depend on four things. The first is depth. Can Ukraine keep pushing the effective interdiction zone farther into the Russian rear? Or will improvements in electronic warfare and defenses begin to push it back? The second is persistence. Occasional spectacular strikes are not enough. A logistics system changes behavior when the threat is recurring and predictable enough that planners have to redesign movement around it. The third is throughput. The most important evidence will not be another burning truck. It will be signs that Russian units are taking longer to reinforce, that supplies are becoming harder to accumulate, that staging areas must move farther back, or that more resources are required to sustain the same offensive effort. And the fourth is territorial conversion. If Russia continues feeding large quantities of manpower and material into the war while the rate of operational advance continues to fall, the case will grow stronger that tactical drone pressure is producing effects at the operational level. If Russian forces adapt and restore a higher tempo, the argument has to be narrowed. That is what makes this an unresolved strategic contest rather than a victory story. Russia still has depth. It still has redundancy. It still has the ability to recruit, produce, reroute, repair, and continue fighting. Ukraine, meanwhile, is fighting with a smaller resource base and faces the same threat to its own logistics from Russian drones and long-range strikes. Neither side has escaped the problem. The battlefield has simply moved deeper, and that may be the larger lesson of this war. Modern military power is not defined only by how many soldiers a country can mobilize, how many shells it can manufacture, or how many vehicles it can place in storage. It is defined by how much of that potential can still be delivered, concentrated, coordinated, and sustained while the enemy is actively attacking the system that makes it usable. Russia still has the mass. Ukraine has not taken that away. It is attacking the machinery that turns mass into momentum. And the question that matters now is not whether Russia still has more. It is how much of that more can still arrive at the front as usable combat power, and at what cost.